And now, the Deeper Thinking podcast, where philosophy, psychology, and power collide.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Democracy's survival has always depended on the willingness of its citizens to invest in it, not only through voting, but through sustained engagement, debate, and the collective defense of its principles. Yet, political philosophers from Aristotle to Schumpeter have long recognized that democracy is vulnerable to cycles of decline, often driven by economic inequality, elite capture, and the erosion of civic trust. Aristotle, in Politics, argued that democracies tend toward oligarchy when wealth concentrates in the hands of a few, shifting power away from the many. Centuries later, Joseph Schumpeter reframed democracy in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy as a system of elite competition rather than popular rule, reducing citizen participation to the act of choosing between pre-selected political actors. If this is true, then the legitimacy of democracy rests not in active citizen engagement, but in the illusion of choice. What happens when that illusion fades? Recent decades have seen growing disillusionment with democratic institutions, often justified by their failures to address economic inequality, corruption, and systemic inefficiencies. The neoliberal order, as described by thinkers like Michel Foucault and Wendy Brown, has recast individuals as competitive market actors rather than civic participants. In this framework, political engagement is transactional, evaluated in terms of personal cost-benefit analysis rather than collective duty. This economic rationalization of democracy leads to a retreat from public life. If politics offers no tangible returns, why participate? The result is a cycle of disengagement where declining participation reinforces elite dominance, which in turn accelerates disillusionment. Political theorist Sheldon Wolin called this inverted totalitarianism, a system in which democratic structures remain, but real power shifts to unaccountable economic and bureaucratic forces. Compounding this trend is the role of digital media in reshaping political consciousness. Walter Lippmann, in Public Opinion, warned that mass media could manufacture consent by shaping perceptions rather than informing debate. Today, this phenomenon has intensified in ways even Lippmann could not have imagined. Social media, algorithmic curation, and the rise of infotainment have altered how citizens engage with democracy, prioritizing emotional response over critical discourse. Instead of deliberation, we see reaction. Instead of engagement, performance. The philosopher Byung-Chul describes this shift as a move from the disciplinary society to the society of transparency, where information saturation leads not to greater understanding but to a paralysis of action. In such an environment, democratic participation risks becoming aesthetic rather than substantive, a symbolic act rather than a means of shaping governance. The consequences of this transformation are profound. If democracy is performative, does it still function? If participation is reduced to signalling rather than influencing, does the will of the people still matter? And if trust in democratic institutions collapses, what replaces them? As Carl Schmitt argued, all political orders are defined by their capacity to maintain legitimacy. If democracy loses that capacity, does it remain democracy at all? The crisis of democracy is not just political or institutional, it is deeply psychological. To understand why citizens withdraw from democratic participation, we must examine the emotional and cognitive forces that shape political engagement. Political theorists such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Stuart Mill argued that democracy requires an active citizenry, one that is educated, engaged, and willing to defend its collective interests. Yet, modern democracies have cultivated the opposite, a public that feels increasingly powerless, overwhelmed, and fatigued. Political alienation, as defined by Karl Marx in his theory of alienation, occurs when individuals no longer see their labour, or in this case their participation, as meaningful. In a world where governments seem unresponsive to popular demands, where elections feel like rituals rather than mechanisms of change, and where economic structures prioritise efficiency over representation, democracy begins to feel ornamental rather than functional. Hannah Arendt, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, described the dangers of mass apathy, arguing that when citizens disengage from the political realm, they create the conditions for authoritarianism to emerge, not necessarily through violent coups, but through the absence of resistance. This disengagement is not passive, it is cultivated. The modern information economy, as theorized by Shoshana Zuboff in The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, has restructured attention itself, directing political focus away from long-term democratic stewardship and toward momentary outrage cycles. The attention economy rewards provocation, not deliberation, division, not consensus. This has profound implications for political behavior. Research in cognitive psychology, particularly the work of Daniel Kahneman on fast and slow thinking, suggests that humans are more likely to engage with political issues emotionally rather than rationally. When politics is shaped by emotional reaction rather than sustained reasoning, democratic engagement becomes sporadic, impulsive, and driven by immediate stimuli rather than structural concerns. Compounding this is the phenomenon of learned helplessness, first studied by psychologist Martin Seligman. When individuals repeatedly experience political frustration, policies that fail to materialize, representatives who break promises, institutions that seem rigged, they begin to internalize the belief that their actions do not matter. Over time, this belief calcifies into disengagement. This aligns with Antonio Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony, in which dominant systems maintain power not through force, but by shaping what people see as possible. If democracy appears immovable, if power structures seem impervious to challenge, then withdrawal is not just a personal choice, it is a conditioned response. This psychological withdrawal from democracy is perhaps more dangerous than any external attack, because it corrodes the foundation of the system itself. If citizens no longer see democracy as an agent of change, then what incentive remains to sustain it? And if political resignation becomes the default mode of the electorate, what kind of governance emerges in its place? Democracy requires belief. Without it, what remains is not a republic, but an empty stage where participation is a performance and governance is done elsewhere, beyond the reach of the people it claims to serve. The erosion of democracy is not simply a failure of institutions, but a transformation in the way power is distributed and perceived. As Michel Foucault argued in Discipline and Punish, power is not merely exercised through laws and coercion, but through systems of knowledge, habits, and self-regulation. In modern democracies, this shift is evident in the way governance is increasingly mediated by unelected institutions, corporate influence, and algorithmic decision-making. The result is what political theorist Wendy calls de-democratization, a process in which the formal structures of democracy remain intact, while its substantive power is gradually hollowed out. Elections still occur, laws are still passed, and representatives still govern, but the capacity of the public to shape these processes diminishes. This shift is most visible in the growing role of technocracy, where decisions that once belonged to democratic deliberation are now outsourced to experts, financial institutions, and opaque bureaucratic networks. As Jürgen Habermas argued in The Theory of Communicative Action, democracy relies on the public sphere, a space where citizens debate, contest, and influence political life. But today, these spaces have been privatized or made inaccessible, replaced by data-driven governance that distances decision-making from public scrutiny. Mark Fisher, in Capitalist Realism, described this as a form of political inertia, where systemic forces feel so unchangeable that alternatives become unthinkable. If democracy is reduced to a bureaucratic formality, a system where citizens merely ratify decisions made elsewhere, then its legitimacy erodes, not through revolution but through quiet disillusionment. The effects of this shift are visible in declining electoral participation, increased polarization, and the emergence of what political scientist Peter Mayer called the void, a space where political parties and institutions no longer represent distinct ideological visions, but instead manage public expectations while maintaining the status quo. The disappearance of genuine political alternatives reinforces the perception that voting is a choice without consequence. Antonio Gramsci's theory of passive revolution describes this process well. Rather than dramatic political upheaval, power reconfigures itself from within, adapting in ways that neutralize dissent while maintaining the illusion of participation. This is not to say that democracy disappears entirely, rather it mutates into something less recognizable. Carl Schmitt, in The Concept of the Political, argued that all political systems ultimately function on the basis of sovereignty, the ability to decide in moments of crisis. When democratic institutions lose their ability to act decisively, power migrates elsewhere. The question then becomes, if elected governments are no longer the central locus of decision-making, who is? In an era where multinational corporations, intelligence agencies, and algorithmic governance shape daily life as much as elected officials do, democracy risks becoming a ceremonial structure, present in form, absent in function. And if governance no longer requires public participation, then what remains of the idea of democracy itself? The transformation of democracy into a managed bureaucratic system has consequences that extend beyond governance. It alters the very way citizens relate to politics. If democracy once demanded participation and belief, it now often functions as what Jean Baudrillard called a simulacrum, a representation of democracy that no longer corresponds to real political agency. Baudrillard, in Simulacra and Simulation, argued that modern societies operate through hyper-reality, where symbols replace the thing they once represented. In this sense, contemporary elections, political discourse, and public engagement often serve more as performances than as mechanisms of power redistribution. The image of democracy remains intact, but its substance is increasingly elusive. This shift is not accidental. As political theorist Sheldon Wolin described in Democracy Incorporated, contemporary democracy has merged with corporate structures to form inverted totalitarianism, a system in which economic and bureaucratic elites govern without requiring overt authoritarian control. Instead of mass suppression, this form of governance operates through distraction, consumerism, and the gradual disempowerment of public institutions. The result is a citizenry that is neither fully oppressed nor fully engaged, existing in a liminal space where political action feels simultaneously necessary and futile. Hannah Arendt, in The Human Condition, warned against this kind of political alienation, arguing that when citizens retreat into private life, they surrender the public realm to those who seek to dominate it. At the core of this crisis is the changing nature of legitimacy. Max Weber, in Politics as a Vocation, identified three sources of legitimacy: traditional authority rooted in custom, charismatic authority rooted in leadership, and legal rational authority rooted in institutions. Democracy ideally thrives on legal rational legitimacy. Citizens believe in the system because its rules are fair, its processes transparent, and its institutions responsive. But when governments fail to address economic inequality, when policies are dictated more by financial markets than by public will, and when political debates become media spectacles rather than genuine deliberations, legal rational legitimacy begins to wane. What replaces it is either cynicism or the search for more immediate, emotionally resonant forms of authority. This helps explain the rise of both hyper-individualist disengagement and populist reaction. For some, democracy's failures lead to withdrawal, what political scientist Colin Crouch calls post-democracy, a state in which elites govern with little input from the masses. For others, it fuels a search for more direct, effective forms of political expression, often in the form of strongman leaders or reactionary movements that promise to bypass the complexities of democratic negotiation. Carl Schmitt's notion of the friend-enemy distinction becomes relevant here. As traditional democratic structures weaken, politics becomes less about governance and more about existential battles over identity and power. The question, then, is not simply whether democracy is fading, but what will replace it. If traditional forms of political engagement no longer inspire belief, what alternative structures will emerge? If people cease to see democracy as a vehicle for change, where will they direct their demands? And if power continues to consolidate in the hands of unaccountable elites, will the idea of democracy itself become a relic of the past? If democracy is eroding, what emerges in its place? The decline of democratic participation does not create a vacuum. It invites new forms of governance, influence, and control that function beyond traditional electoral politics. Antonio Gramsci, in his theory of cultural hegemony, argued that power does not simply reside in governments or institutions, but in the ability to shape what people see as normal, possible, or inevitable. When citizens disengage from formal politics, they do not become apolitical. Rather, they shift their engagement to alternative spheres, corporate influence, digital subcultures, private networks of power that redefine governance in ways democracy was never designed to accommodate. One emerging force is what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, outlined in The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, where data-driven corporations exert control not through laws, but through algorithmic prediction, behavioral manipulation, and mass data collection. In this model, democratic consent is increasingly irrelevant because decisions about governance, what people see, what policies are feasible, what narratives dominate, are shaped not by elected officials but by proprietary algorithms designed to maximize engagement and profit. Jürgen Habermas warned that democracy depends on the public sphere, a space where citizens can deliberate and form a collective will. But in an age where public discourse is fragmented, curated, and commodified by private entities, democratic debate is increasingly shaped by forces outside the reach of government. The result is a form of power that is neither accountable nor visible, yet deeply influential in determining the contours of political reality. Another shift occurs in the rise of authoritarian neoliberalism, described by William Davies in The Limits of Neoliberalism, where market-driven governance supplants democratic deliberation. In this system, economic logic dictates political priorities. Budgets are set not by public need but by credit ratings. Policies are determined not by voters but by financial stability indices. As Colin Crouch described in Post-Democracy, democratic institutions still exist, but their ability to shape economic and social outcomes is increasingly constrained by global financial imperatives. In this context, voting becomes less an exercise of power and more a symbolic ritual, a performance of democracy rather than its actualization. This reality has led some theorists, such as David Runciman in How Democracy Ends, to argue that we may already be living in a post-democratic world, one in which democratic forms persist but no longer serve their original function. If democracy is no longer the primary vehicle for collective decision-making, then what is? Carl Schmitt suggested that all political systems ultimately resolve into a struggle over sovereignty. Who has the final authority to decide? In a world where democratic institutions are weakened, that authority is increasingly diffuse, shifting toward corporations, technology firms, and private networks of power. The consequences of this transformation are profound. If democracy no longer operates as the primary mechanism of governance, do citizens still have meaningful political agency? If traditional institutions become secondary to corporate and algorithmic power, what happens to concepts like representation, accountability, and the public good? And if people cease to believe that democracy offers a viable path for shaping their lives, do they seek alternatives? Or do they simply surrender to the illusion that no alternative exists at all? If democracy is no longer the dominant organizing principle of governance, what takes its place? The slow unraveling of democratic legitimacy is not merely an institutional crisis, but a transformation in the very nature of power. Max Weber's concept of legitimacy, outlined in Economy and Society, provides a useful framework for understanding this shift. Weber identified three primary forms of legitimate authority: traditional, rooted in historical continuity; charismatic, rooted in individual leadership; and legal rational, rooted in impersonal systems of rules. Democracy, at its best, relies on legal rational legitimacy, the idea that power is justified through transparent procedures, elections, and institutional accountability. However, as economic inequalities deepen, institutions become more opaque, and public trust erodes, democracy's reliance on legal rational legitimacy becomes unstable. In its place, we see a reversion to other forms of authority. The allure of charismatic leadership, the resurgence of nationalist and religious traditionalism, and the increasing dominance of technocratic governance. Charismatic authority thrives in moments of democratic disillusionment. When institutions fail, people seek figures who promise to bypass bureaucratic stagnation and deliver immediate results. This explains the rise of political strongmen who, as Carl Schmitt argued in Political Theology, position themselves as sovereign actors capable of deciding in moments of crisis. Unlike institutional democracy, which depends on slow negotiation and compromise, charismatic leadership offers the illusion of direct action. This appeal is particularly strong in societies where democratic institutions appear gridlocked or incapable of addressing urgent crises. Schmitt warned that when legal rational authority collapses, politics does not disappear. It simply shifts to more primal forms of power, structured around allegiance, loyalty, and conflict. Simultaneously, traditional authority is resurging in many parts of the world, whether through religious nationalism, cultural revivalism, or the return to identity-based politics. People increasingly seek stability in the past. Weber saw traditional authority as a counterweight to modern bureaucracies, often used to justify rule based on historical precedent rather than contemporary democratic principles. The philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre, in After Virtue, argued that the failure of modern liberalism to provide a coherent moral framework has led to the re-emergence of traditionalist movements that seek order in history, religion, and inherited cultural values. This retreat into traditionalism is not necessarily a rejection of democracy itself, but rather an indictment of its perceived failure to offer meaning beyond procedural governance. At the same time, technocratic authority is expanding. As Wendy Brown describes in Undoing the Demos, economic rationality has come to define political life, shifting governance away from public deliberation and toward rule by experts, financial institutions, and algorithmic systems. Weber himself warned that bureaucracy, once established, tends to perpetuate itself, becoming increasingly detached from the people it was designed to serve. In this system, elections may continue, but their outcomes are increasingly constrained by economic imperatives and institutional inertia. This form of governance resembles what political scientist Jacques Rancière calls post-democracy, a system where political structures remain but no longer function as true mechanisms of collective decision-making. The convergence of these forces, charismatic leadership, traditionalist revival, and technocratic governance, suggests that democracy is not merely weakening, but being reconfigured. The question is whether these shifts represent an adaptation of democracy or its quiet replacement. If democratic institutions no longer hold decisive power, what role remains for the citizen? If elections and laws are subordinate to economic and algorithmic decision-making, is political agency still meaningful? And if democracy continues to function primarily as a symbolic ritual rather than a mechanism of governance, will people continue to invest in it, or will they search for something else? If democracy is evolving into something unrecognizable, the question is not simply whether it can be revived, but whether it is still the most viable system for collective governance. Political theorists from Jacques Rousseau to Jacques Rancière have argued that democracy, at its core, is a system of struggle, a continuous process of renegotiating power rather than a static institutional arrangement. If this is true, then the decline of traditional democratic structures does not necessarily signal the end of democracy, but rather a transition to new forms of political organisation. However, what replaces electoral democracy is not necessarily more democratic in nature. In an era shaped by economic consolidation, digital surveillance, and geopolitical instability, alternative systems of governance are emerging that redefine political participation in ways democracy was never designed to accommodate. One of these emerging systems is what Byung-Chul describes as psychopolitical governance, a form of control that operates not through force, but through internalized discipline. In the Transparency Society, Han argues that traditional forms of state coercion are being replaced by more insidious methods: social media surveillance, data-driven behavioral nudging, and a culture of constant self-exposure. This aligns with Michel Foucault's theory of biopolitics, in which power functions through the regulation of life itself rather than through explicit repression. In this model, democratic engagement does not disappear. It is restructured into a form of self-governance that aligns individual behaviour with the interests of corporate and political elites. Instead of participating in deliberative democracy, citizens engage through the curated mechanisms of digital platforms, liking, sharing, commenting, while real decision-making migrates elsewhere. Meanwhile, Carl Schmitt's notion of the exception, the ability of sovereign actors to suspend democratic norms in moments of crisis, has become a defining feature of contemporary governance. States increasingly invoke emergency powers, whether in response to pandemics, economic instability, or security threats, consolidating authority in ways that bypass democratic oversight. Giorgio Agamben, in State of Exception, warns that this shift normalizes extraordinary powers, creating a system in which legal protections and democratic rights become conditional rather than absolute. This raises the question: if emergency governance becomes the default mode of political decision-making, does democracy still function as a meaningful system of rule? At the same time, we are witnessing the rise of what Shoshana Zuboff calls instrumentarian power, where corporate and state entities use predictive analytics and behavioral modification to shape political engagement. This is not simply surveillance, it is a restructuring of governance itself. In the age of surveillance capitalism, Zuboff argues that the ability to anticipate and direct human behavior has created a new form of power, one that renders traditional electoral politics increasingly irrelevant. If the most consequential decisions about social organization are determined by algorithms rather than legislation, then voting becomes a symbolic act rather than an exercise of political agency. This transition raises profound questions about the future of governance. If democracy is no longer the primary mechanism for shaping collective life, what replaces it? If citizens are increasingly governed through psychological manipulation, algorithmic prediction, and emergency powers, is political freedom still possible? And if democracy has already been quietly transformed into a new system, one that retains its outward symbols but not its substance, then the real question may not be whether it can be saved, but whether we have already entered a post-democratic world without realizing it. If we have entered a post-democratic world, the implications extend beyond governance. They redefine the very concept of political agency. The philosopher Jacques Rancière, in Disagreement, argued that democracy is not merely a system of elections, but an ongoing struggle over who gets to be heard and who is rendered invisible. If traditional democratic structures continue to exist but no longer serve as genuine mechanisms of representation, then politics itself must be re-examined. Are we still participants in a democratic process, or have we become passive spectators of a system that moves forward without us? This shift is not without precedent. Walter Benjamin, in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, warned of the dangers of aesthetics replacing genuine political engagement. He argued that when political movements become overly aestheticized, when they prioritize spectacle over substance, power is increasingly centralized in the hands of those who control the means of cultural production. In contemporary politics, this phenomenon manifests in the transformation of governance into performance. Leaders craft personas optimized for media consumption, policies are framed as brand strategies, and public outrage is monetized rather than addressed. In such an environment, participation is no longer about shaping decisions, but about reaffirming identities. This aligns with the work of Guy Debord, who in The Society of the Spectacle described how modern politics is consumed as entertainment rather than as a vehicle for collective action. The consequences of this transformation are not just institutional, but psychological. Antonio Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony describes how dominant power structures maintain control, not through force, but by shaping public consciousness. In a political landscape where meaningful change feels unattainable, citizens are conditioned to see democracy as a static reality rather than a contested space. The late David Graeber, in The Utopia of Rules, described how bureaucratic inertia can create a sense of political paralysis, where individuals cease to imagine alternatives because they assume the system is unchangeable. If democracy is no longer perceived as a tool for transformation, then what incentive remains to engage with it? The philosopher Giorgio Agamben provides a further lens through which to examine this shift. In Homo Sacer, he argues that modern political systems increasingly function through the production of bare life, populations that are managed rather than represented. In this model, citizens are reduced to economic and biometric data points, governed through algorithmic systems that optimize efficiency rather than justice. This reality is already emerging in the rise of digital governance, where decisions once made through democratic deliberation are now outsourced to artificial intelligence, risk assessment algorithms, and predictive analytics. The future of democracy may therefore depend not only on whether its institutions can be reformed, but on whether new forms of political engagement can emerge. If democracy is to survive, it must move beyond its procedural shell and reclaim its capacity for substantive decision-making. If not, we may find ourselves in a world where democracy exists only as an idea, a memory of something that once promised power to the people, but in the end was quietly repurposed for something else. If democracy has become a ritual rather than a mechanism of power, then the challenge is not simply to revive participation, but to redefine what participation means. The political theorist Chantal Mouffe, in The Democratic Paradox, argues that democracy is inherently sustained by a productive tension between competing visions of the good society. In this view, the disappearance of genuine political alternatives is not a sign of democracy's stability, but of its erosion. When politics becomes a contest between nearly identical managerial elites, when elections serve more to validate existing power structures than to challenge them, democracy loses its essential function as a space for radical contestation. The result is what Mouffe calls post-politics, a world where major ideological battles are replaced by technical debates and where political engagement is reduced to a narrow spectrum of acceptable opinions. This narrowing of political possibilities is not accidental. Slavoj Žižek, building on Mouffe's work, argues that contemporary democracies sustain themselves through the illusion of choice. In The Sublime Object of Ideology, he describes how political systems pacify dissent by offering carefully curated forms of opposition that never threaten the underlying structure. In this way, democracy becomes a closed loop, a system that absorbs resistance while ensuring that no fundamental transformation occurs. This helps explain why electoral participation continues to decline in many advanced democracies, not because people lack interest in politics, but because they no longer believe that voting changes anything. The political philosopher Wendy Brown, in The Ruins of Neoliberalism, describes this as the slow death of democratic hope, a process in which citizens are trained to expect nothing from politics and in turn to demand nothing from it. Compounding this crisis is the role of technology in reshaping political consciousness. The philosopher Bernard Stiegler warned in The Automatic Society that algorithmic governance risks replacing public deliberation with automated decision-making. As artificial intelligence and big data increasingly mediate political discourse, the conditions for genuine debate become harder to sustain. Instead of a public sphere where ideas compete, we now inhabit what Jürgen Habermas calls a colonized life world, a space where political engagement is engineered by corporate and governmental algorithms that optimize for engagement rather than truth. This digital fragmentation accelerates what the historian Timothy Snyder describes in The Road to Unfreedom as the transition from democratic politics to schizopolitics, a condition where multiple realities coexist, making consensus nearly impossible. If democracy is to be more than an aesthetic performance, it must reassert its ability to disrupt power rather than simply manage it. This requires rethinking not only electoral systems, but also the deeper structures of political engagement. Can new forms of participatory democracy emerge in a world dominated by algorithmic governance? Can political action reclaim its role as a means of genuine transformation rather than symbolic affirmation? And if democracy is no longer a space for real contestation, where will the next struggles over power take place? These questions will determine whether democracy continues as a living political force or fades into something else, an image of itself, preserved for appearances, but emptied of substance. If democracy is to survive as more than a symbolic system, it must confront not only its structural limitations, but the deeper existential question of whether people still believe in it. Throughout history, democratic resilience has depended not only on laws and institutions, but on a shared conviction that participation matters. The historian Pierre Rosanvallon, in Democratic Legitimacy, argues that democracy is always incomplete, always evolving, and always at risk. Unlike autocratic regimes, which impose order from above, Democracy must constantly renew itself through public engagement. But what happens when this renewal fails? What happens when the mechanisms of democracy persist but the belief that sustains them fades? One answer is that democracy simply adapts, shifting into new forms that reflect changing social and technological realities. Political theorist Helene Landemore in Open Democracy envisions a future where democratic participation is no longer limited to periodic elections but is instead continuous, facilitated by digital deliberation, sortition-based governance, and new forms of decentralized decision-making. In this model, democracy evolves beyond its electoral foundations, redistributing power more directly to citizens. However, such an evolution depends on the assumption that people still want to participate in governance, an assumption that is increasingly in question. If the erosion of democracy is not just institutional but psychological, can new democratic forms emerge when political exhaustion and disillusionment have taken root? Alternatively, the quiet disappearance of democracy may not provoke resistance at all. Hannah Arendt, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, warned that democracy does not always collapse through violence or dramatic rupture. Sometimes it fades because people simply cease to defend it. The philosopher Giorgio Agamben, in The Coming Community, describes a future in which power no longer relies on mass mobilization but on passive acceptance. In such a world, democracy does not formally end, it simply ceases to function in any meaningful way. Citizens continue to vote, political institutions persist, but real decisions are made elsewhere in spaces inaccessible to the public. The political theorist Colin Crouch has already described this shift as post-democracy, a system in which democratic procedures remain but no longer serve as vehicles for collective power. If we are entering such a world, the final question is whether democracy can be reclaimed or whether it has already been repurposed into something else. Does a new model of participatory governance lie ahead, or will power continue to consolidate in unelected institutions, algorithmic systems, and corporate networks? If democracy is to survive, it cannot merely exist in name. It must offer people a reason to believe in it again. But if belief is what ultimately sustains democracy, then perhaps its fate was never written in institutions, laws, or constitutions. Perhaps it was always determined by a more fragile thing, the willingness of people to choose it again and again before it disappears for good. Until next time.
This episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast was written, produced, and researched by Benjamin James. It was read by Holly, a digital narrator. For further reading, resources, and a chance to support the show, visit the episode webpage, where you'll find book recommendations, key topics to explore, and a way to buy me a coffee. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on your preferred platform